The air inside the dimly lit room felt heavier than the walls themselves, as if every secret ever whispered between these people had condensed into a single, suffocating silence. The long mahogany table stretched out like a battlefield, polished to a shine that reflected the tension etched on every face. No one spoke. No one dared. The ticking of the old clock on the wall was the only sound brave enough to interrupt the oppressive stillness, and even it seemed to echo like a warning. Eyes darted from one to another, measuring, accusing, waiting. The truth was close. Too close. It hovered like a blade above them all, ready to cut through the thin fabric of trust that held the family together. Tonight would not be remembered as a simple family gathering. Tonight would be the beginning of an unraveling. The silence inside the room was suffocating, pressing down on every chest with the weight of something unspoken and dangerous. The family had gathered, not for a celebration, not for a reunion, but for something no one could define out loud. The heavy mahogany walls seemed to absorb every breath, the polished floor reflected nothing but shadow, and the chandelier above, usually radiant, felt distant and cold. Vernon stood at the head of the long table, the position that had always been his by right, by power, by decades of authority no one had ever dared to question. In his hands was a thin folder, but the paper inside carried the weight of a storm. Weeks of covert investigations, financial anomalies traced back to invisible leaks, accounts that bled quietly like an old wound. He had not told anyone. Not a soul. If there was one thing Vernon knew, it was that power dies not with a sword, but with whispers. And someone had been whispering. Someone on the inside. He did not need to speak for the tension to grow. It fed itself. Every breath in that room was laced with suspicion. Eyes shifted, but no one dared to break the silence. The Dupree family had built an empire. An empire wrapped in elegance and influence, but beneath it, every alliance was fragile. For years, Vernon had kept it intact through fear, respect, and control. He had protected them, fed them, guided them, chained them. He had believed that fear was enough to keep loyalty intact. But tonight, that belief would shatter. He stared at each face in turn. They all looked back with some version of the same expression, confusion, dread, or a carefully constructed mask. They had all benefited from his control, but they also feared it. Vernon's eyes were sharp, moving from one person to another. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind over and over, the reveal, the questions, the exposure of the traitor. He expected resistance. Denials. A fight. But what he did not expect was Nicole. She rose before he could finish unfolding the last page. The motion was subtle, but in the frozen tension of the room, it was like a scream. Every gaze turned to her. No one understood what they were witnessing. Nicole, the one he trusted the most, the one who had grown up under his shadow, the one who was supposed to inherit everything, was standing with a stillness that burned like ice. She didn't flinch under their stares. She didn't need to speak. Her action alone carried the weight of a confession. Her calmness was louder than any defense could ever be. Vernon's heart twisted not from shock, but from something far more devastating, the slow realization that she had been waiting for this moment. The betrayal was not impulsive. It had been deliberate. Calculated. Inevitable. His mind fractured into 1,000 memories. Nicole as a child, chasing the light through the gardens of the estate. Nicole as a teenager, standing proudly beside him at the company's anniversary gala. Nicole, his prodigy, his extension, his symbol of control. He had sculpted her future before she even understood the meaning of choice. She was supposed to be his legacy, not his enemy. And yet, she had burned the foundation beneath them. Around the table, shock rippled like a chain reaction. Those who had always seen Nicole as untouchable were suddenly confronted with something they couldn't process. She was the last person anyone suspected. Her image had been carved into their minds as unshakable loyalty. If Nicole could betray Vernon, then anyone could. The fracture wasn't just between father and daughter. It was ripping through the entire structure of their world. Vernon's body felt cold. Not the kind of cold that passes, but the kind that settles deep into the bones. His hands clenched tighter around the folder, crushing the edges. He imagined for a brief, cruel moment that if he squeezed hard enough, the betrayal would disappear like a bad dream. But the truth was already out. There was no return. The faces around the table blurred for him. All he could see was Nicole, standing tall, emotionless, her silence sharper than a blade. She did not tremble. She did not avert her eyes. She didn't look like a victim or an opportunist. She looked like someone who had made a choice long ago and was simply stepping into the storm she herself had summoned. The room thickened with anger. Not just Vernon's, but everyone's. Old wounds that had been buried beneath polished smiles began to open quietly. Some felt betrayed by Nicole. Others, secretly, felt a dangerous flicker of admiration. Few had ever dared to stand against Vernon. She had just crossed a line that no one thought could be crossed. Nicole had always lived in a golden cage. She was the perfect heir, intelligent, disciplined, chained to the expectations Vernon had written for her. But a cage made of gold is still a cage. For years, she had felt the invisible weight of being someone else's creation. Every success of hers was never hers. It was his. Every choice, an echo of his will. She had been praised for loyalty, but loyalty had slowly rotted into resentment. The day she realized that the only way to reclaim herself was to destroy the empire she was supposed to inherit was the day her fate was sealed. The betrayal had begun long before tonight. Vernon, for all his power, had never noticed. He had built an empire so fortified that he'd forgotten to watch for the cracks inside his own walls. He had looked outward for enemies, never inward. Now the enemy wore the face he loved most. It was not hatred that burned in his chest, it was something worse. A violent collision between disbelief, rage, and the unbearable sting of personal failure. The people seated around the table began to shift in their chairs, their thoughts colliding with the brutal reality. Nicole's confession wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a destabilizing force that would rip through every alliance, every quiet loyalty, every unspoken rule in this family. No one could trust anyone anymore. And that was exactly what Nicole intended. She did not glance at Vernon as she stood there. She didn't need to. She already knew what his mind would look like now, a storm of strategies and vengeance. Vernon was not a man who forgave. He was a man who eradicated threats. And now, the threat had his own blood. The fury in Vernon's chest grew quieter, colder, sharper. He was not the kind of man who exploded in rage. His anger was methodical. He didn't shout. He planned. His eyes darkened not from shock but from the slow, precise formation of a decision. A line had been crossed, and once a line is crossed in Vernon's world, there is no return. Nicole, too, knew that. She had walked into this room prepared to burn bridges so thoroughly that there would be no path back. She had chosen to become a threat to him, not accidentally, but deliberately. There was no regret in her expression. Only the chilling certainty of someone who had already accepted what would come next. No one spoke. No one dared to move. The tension in the room was unbearable, heavy like smoke. Each person at the table carried their own fear, their own calculations. Some thought about their positions, their wealth, their safety. Others thought about whether siding with Vernon or Nicole would ensure their survival. The power structure of the family was cracking right before their eyes. The meeting ended without a word. There were no accusations, no screaming, no breakdowns. Silence was more terrifying than noise. One by one, the others left, their footsteps echoing down the long hallway like the sound of something being dismantled piece by piece. Vernon remained. So did Nicole, until she turned away with the same calmness she had arrived with. She did not need to say anything. She had already detonated the bomb. When the door finally closed behind her, the weight of betrayal settled fully in the room. Vernon stood alone, still holding the crushed folder, staring at the empty chair she had left behind. The memories of her loyalty turned to ash in his hands. He felt the full gravity of what had happened. This was not a single act of treachery. It was the beginning of a war. Nicole walked down the hallway slowly, her heels sinking into the thick carpet, absorbing the echoes. Her heart did not race. She felt no panic. Just an icy clarity. She had carried this weight for years, the burden of loyalty to a system that suffocated her. Now that she had severed it, she felt a twisted sense of freedom. It was not joy. It was liberation wrapped in destruction. She knew the cost. She knew Vernon. He would not let this betrayal go unanswered. But she also knew she was ready. She had not stepped into the darkness blindly. She had built her path carefully. Vernon had raised her to be strong, calculating, dangerous. He had created the very weapon that would now turn against him. Back in the room, Vernon's silence grew darker. He had always believed that loyalty could be bought, demanded, enforced. He had been wrong. And being wrong was something he did not forgive. Not in others, not in himself. His mind began to form plans. Cold, methodical plans. Nicole's betrayal was not just a wound, it was a declaration of war. And Vernon had never lost a war. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass of the estate windows. The world seemed still, as if holding its breath. The Dupree Empire had always stood unshaken against external forces. But empires do not crumble from outside attacks. They fall from cracks within. And Nicole had just torn the first one wide open. That night, the house was quiet. Too quiet. But silence in the Dupree household was never peace. It was the sound of knives being sharpened behind closed doors. Nicole retreated to her own wing of the estate. She stared out at the garden where she had once played as a child. She could still remember Vernon's hand on her shoulder, guiding her, molding her. Everything in this place was shaped by him, the furniture, the paintings, the walls, even her. But now, none of it belonged to her anymore. She had claimed something far more dangerous, autonomy. But freedom is never free. It demands sacrifice. And Nicole knew she had burned the one thing she could never rebuild, trust. Yet she felt no regret. Only a brutal kind of resolve. Meanwhile, the rest of the family scattered through the house like ghosts. Some shut their doors, pretending nothing had happened. Some whispered behind closed curtains. Some sat in darkness, calculating their next moves. The betrayal had cracked something fundamental. Lines would soon be drawn. Loyalties would be tested. Survival would become the only law. Vernon, still in the same room, finally let the crushed folder fall onto the table. He stared at it like it was a corpse. His jaw tightened, the muscles in his face carved by fury restrained by calculation. He would not forgive. He would not forget. He had spent a lifetime building power, and he would spend the rest of it destroying anything that threatened it. Even if that meant destroying his own blood. Nicole's name burned in his mind, not as his daughter anymore, but as a rival. In the cold, silent dark of the night, something inside Vernon hardened irreversibly. The man who had once ruled through control now found a new purpose, vengeance. And Nicole, walking through the same darkness, knew this too. She had set the war in motion. The only question now was who would survive it. The room was no longer filled with words, only the echo of everything that had been said. The chairs sat empty, but their presence still lingered like ghosts, silent witnesses to a night that none of them could ever erase. The scent of old wood and cold air clung stubbornly to the walls, but what truly lingered was the bitterness, a slow, corrosive poison that had begun to eat its way into every corner of their fractured trust. Vernon stood alone at the end of the table, his hands pressed against the polished surface as if anchoring himself to something real. But there was nothing real anymore, not the promises, not the loyalty, not even the blood that tied them together. He had thought betrayal would come from the outside, from an enemy he could fight, name, destroy. But it came from within. From Nicole. From someone he trusted without hesitation. That wound cut deeper than any knife could. It wasn't just the loss of control, it was the humiliation, the quiet realization that the cracks had been there all along and he had chosen not to see them. Now they were splitting open, unstoppable, swallowing everything he built. Nicole's confession didn't just divide the family, it detonated something at its core. Even after she left the room, her absence screamed louder than her words. The others had gone home with faces pale and eyes lowered, carrying pieces of their broken allegiance like invisible shrapnel lodged beneath their skin. Every gesture, every breath, every unspoken thought tonight was a reminder that nothing would be the same again. Vernon traced the faint ring of condensation left by Nicole's untouched glass, feeling the chill seeping into his fingertips. That small, meaningless mark on the table now felt like a scar, proof that betrayal had sat among them, quiet and comfortable, waiting for its moment. He wondered if it had always been there, festering beneath polite smiles and Sunday dinners, hiding in the spaces between carefully chosen words. Maybe this wasn't the beginning of the end. Maybe the end had started long ago, and tonight was only the moment he finally saw it clearly. His mind replayed Nicole's face when she admitted everything, not defiant, not apologetic, just terrifyingly calm. That calmness was what haunted him most. It meant she had made peace with the decision long before this night. It meant he was the last to know, the last to understand. It meant that the war had been lost long before he even knew it existed. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows with a restless howl, as if the world itself was mocking the silence he was trapped in. Vernon straightened up slowly, the weight of leadership now heavier than it had ever been. This family, this empire, this fragile illusion of unity, it had always been built on control. Now, control was gone. And in its place was only rage, confusion, and the sharp taste of betrayal on his tongue. There would be consequences. Nicole had chosen her side, and whether she understood it or not, lines had been drawn tonight. Vernon was no longer looking for explanations. He was calculating. He was bleeding inside, yes, but behind that wound, something far more dangerous was forming. Cold resolve. She had struck first, and for that, she had rewritten the rules. He turned off the lights one by one, letting the darkness reclaim the room. For a brief second, he imagined the laughter that had once filled this space, warm, naive, human. That world no longer existed. This was a new beginning, not of healing, but of reckoning. And as the door closed behind him with a soft, final click, Vernon knew he would never allow himself to be caught off guard again.